Hi everyone, welcome to the Whiteleyverse with me, Connor Whiteley, for another daily short story. Now, before I start today's story, please remember to like, comment and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content, and the engagement really helps the Whiteleyverse with the YouTube algorithm. Also, if you want to buy this short story and any of my other fiction, then they're available from all major ebook retailers and at your local bookstore and local library if you requested, and you can order paperback copies from Amazon. Now, here's today's short story. I hope you enjoyed just as much as I did writing it.
Loving to spy. Part-time intelligence officer, Stephen Page really loved working in the secret computer labs at Kent University. He really enjoyed the lab's smooth white walls, filled with anti-scanning technology, perfectly soft blue carpet, and all the little computer booths that shot out from the main area he was sitting in so other officers could work. Thankfully, it was only him working the labs today so far, and in all honesty, he wasn't really sure why it was called a computer lab, considering the only computers in the room were in the little booths that shot out from the main area. And even then, all the computer booths were shut behind monitored wooden doors. But Stephen didn't really mind the strange detail. He just loved the location because it was quiet, peaceful, and he could actually crack on with all his university assignments, readings, and intelligence work without anyone watching him. Stephen sat at a large round wooden table that leant to one side because of a dodgy leg that no one had cared to fix just yet, and Stephen wasn't too bothered either. He had dealt with a lot more trouble than a simple, wobbly table leg. The wonderful aromas of fruity blackberry tea, strawberry pastries, and rich creamy hot chocolate filled the air from Stephen's breakfast that he had bought in with him, but at the moment he was a little too busy looking at his black high-security laptop, going through the various morning emails he had been sent. Stephen seriously loved having parents that were some of the UK's best intelligence officers, and he loved that he got to work with them from time to time with other students at the university. But he had never known how many emails he would have to deal with. Most of the emails were great, like new assignments, new threats to the university, because it handled a lot of top-secret government research that China, Russia, and Iran were very interested in, and there were even some well-done emails from heads of departments congratulating Stephen and his friends on their work. But some of the emails were a lot less interesting. Officially, Stephen was a political psychology student at the university, so it didn't sound strange for him to talk to his friends with an in-depth knowledge about how the political worlds worked around the world. But some emails from the British Secret Service, MI6, made it sound like impossible terrorist threats were headed to the university. Of course, it was just MI6 being overdramatic because they weren't meant to be operating on UK soil, but they still made Stephen's stomach tighten each time he read them. The sound of students laughing, talking, and discussing their latest assignments outside made Stephen just smile for a few moments, because he honestly couldn't imagine not knowing what he knew about the world, the university, and the threats he faced. He loved the work, it was amazing, and he got to work with his amazing friends that were meant to be showing up later, but he was still a young man at the end of the day. And it had been so long since he had hooked up, spoken to, or even smiled at a cute man. Stephen was in his final year at university, and he had only had one hookup with a sexy guy in those 3 years. That wasn't a good sex life, by any definition. And now, Stephen was finding that he was having to lie more and more with his non-intelligence friends about his non-existent sex life. It was even worse that Kent University had a thriving gay scene, but Stephen had never actually gone to any gay events to meet people, and with the months ticking down, until he left for good, he was definitely starting to doubt he was ever going to find some fun, action, or maybe even a boyfriend whilst he was still a student. Stephen's laptop pinged, and Stephen smiled at the email from his amazing mum that was addressed to him, his best friend Natasha, and another straight man in their friendship group. There were a lot of files attached, but the email mentioned something about Iran preparing to do a massive cyber attack against the university at any moment. Stephen instantly knew exactly what the Iranians were after. It was so typical. that as much as Michigan 6, counterterrorism, and the entire UK intelligence community tried to hide the fact Kent University was conducting nuclear research for the government, the UK's bloody enemies always found out. Stephen had been stationed and studying at Kent University for years, and he still refused to believe the government's logic for conducting nuclear research at a university. Apparently, the UK's enemies were less likely to target a university compared to a government-owned site. Stephen didn't believe that for a second. But there was one line of his mother's email that really caught Stephen's eye: "Find out how the attack will be launched." Stephen was almost an expert in Iran, geopolitics, and intelligence work. But he knew next to nothing about the interworkings of cyber attacks. Not a single clue. And with a major cyber attack happening any time now, Stephen was growing more and more concerned by the second. University student Phill leant against the wonderfully warm, red brick wall of his best friend Tom's accommodation block at their university. The day was perfectly warm for an autumn day without it being too cold, too warm, and there was even the subtle dampness that made him just know it was autumn. Phill had always loved the amazing season of autumn. It was nowhere near as awful and cold as winter, nor was it as boiling and unbearable as summer, or a weird combination of winter and summer like spring. Autumn was a perfect standalone season that was perfect for Phill. Phill wrapped his hands round the piping hot takeaway cup of coffee that was steaming, and he was holding onto the cup like his life depended on it. That was the weird thing about the cold. It was only his hands that tended to feel cold or icy. The rest of him was fine. Phill waited for Tom to come out of the large glass doors next to him, but in the meantime, Phill focused on the amazing calmness of the early morning outside the accommodation block. The large miniature lake that had a few ducks bobbing along 20 meters away was a great natural feature in amongst the concrete university campus that led onto a massive green field covered in white frost, sloping down towards the city center a few miles away. Phill had always loved Canterbury. It was still a city, but it didn't have the crazy feel of London or Manchester or Leeds. And this early in the morning, the area around Tom's accommodation block was almost perfectly empty, with no one walking along the narrow concrete paths that zigzagged in between all the different accommodation blocks. Phill watched a cute young gay couple that he only knew were gay because the two fit men, clearly first years, were holding their gloved hands together as they smiled and walked towards Canterbury city center. That was going to be a bit of a hike for them, but Phill was really happy for them. That was exactly what he wanted. As bad as it sounded, and Phill couldn't believe it, he had been at university for 4 years now, studying advanced computer science with a year's work experience doing research at the university, and he hadn't dated a single man. He had always been gay. His family had been the ones pushing him to find love and get a boyfriend, but Phill had just found himself too busy to get a boyfriend at university. Phill had dated a little during 6th form and at secondary school, but he was a kid back then. He didn't know anything about relationships. All Phill wanted now, though, was to have a real love at a relationship, sex and maybe love. It was just annoying that Tom was straight. Then all of Phil's problems would be solved, and that was the standing joke between him and Tom. But Phill still couldn't understand why in the world Tom had wanted to meet up with him early. They were already going into the city later tonight with some of their other friends to go clubbing, drinking, and dancing. Yet apparently Tom just had to see Phill this morning. It was so important that Phill couldn't miss it. "Hi," Tom said as he walked out of his accommodation block. Phill always just smiled at his best friend for a few moments whenever he first saw him. Phill really liked how great Tom looked in his black jeans, denim jacket, and black designer trainers that made him look so cool and hot. It was just such a shame he was so straight and actually had a girlfriend. Tom gestured they should start walking down the narrow concrete path that led towards the main campus, and Phill followed. "Why you wanna see me?" Phill asked. Tom grinned. "I can't tell you, but you will not be sorry you met up with me." Phill wanted to say something a little pathetic, like he was already glad he called because he got to see him this morning. Damn it, Phill seriously needed to get with a man a lot sooner rather than later. He hated being this desperate. "Okay," Phill said. "But why all the secrecy? Why don't you just tell me where we're going?" Tom shrugged as he led them through a little concrete tunnel that went through an accommodation block towards the main campus. It was a great shortcut, but Phill would never go through it in the dark. He wasn't that brave. Phill was a little surprised when they came out of the tunnel and Tom hooked a right. No one ever went that way because the main campus was straight ahead. Phill didn't argue. He only kept following Tom as they went down another narrow little pathway with bright orange leaf-covered trees to their left and gray concrete to their right. After a few moments, Tom went into a dark brown wooden building that Phill knew was the computer labs used by the social science division, and Phill just couldn't understand why Tom was taking him in there. Phill didn't know a single person that actually used that building. It was often the butt of a joke because the computer labs looked like a massive shed-like building from the outside because it was completely made of wood. "Come on please," Tom said, grinning. "You will definitely love this." As much as Phill didn't want to go in, and he sort of felt like he was making a big mistake, he knew that Tom was a great friend, and he wouldn't make him do anything bad. Phill went over to the computer labs, went through the large glass door, and went into a room that he could only describe as a main area of sorts with its bright white walls, horrible blue carpet, and tons of wooden doors that were presuming computer pods or something lining the walls. "Who's that, Tom?" a woman asked. Phill looked at the group of people sitting at the end of the main area with their laptops resting on a round wooden table, but there was only one thing he could focus on. Phill had absolutely no idea who the hell was the hot, sexy man was sitting at the table. But by God, he was the hottest man Phill had ever seen. The man was wearing a very smart, almost businesslike dark green jumper that made him look so stylish, hot, and seriously highlighted how fit he was. Phill wouldn't have been surprised if the man had V-cut abs or something. And the man had the most adorable face ever. He had massive, innocent-looking eyes, a killer smile, and a strong, very manly jawline that Phill was really falling for. Phill just looked at Tom quickly, and he quickly realized that next to this man, Tom really didn't look that impressive. "Who is he, Tom?" the woman asked again. "This is the man who's going to help us," Tom said. And as much as a little voice in the back of his head was telling Phill to run, and that he had walked into something very wrong, all he could do was focus on the sexy man with the smart dark green jumper. He was seriously hot. Stephen had always known Tom was probably the smartest and most resourceful of their group of three, and Natasha had only showed up moments before Tom had turned up, but for Tom this seemed very, very strange. For a split second, Stephen had even thought that the new guy could be an enemy agent that had forced Tom to come here, but they had all been trained far too well for that to happen, and Tom wasn't giving any of the 20 subtle signs that he was in danger. With that possibility now thankfully dead, Stephen allowed the black plastic and fabric chair he was sitting on to take his full weight, and he really focused on the new man. It thankfully didn't take him too long to realize how amazingly hot and very cute this hottie was. The man was seriously fit with his slim waist, and the white t-shirt he was wearing definitely highlighted how fit he was, and if anything, years of intelligence training definitely told Stephen it was that the hottie worked out. Not a lot, but enough to keep himself fit and looking very, very nice. Stephen really loved the hottie's pointy face, slightly brown beard, and his blonde crew cut that looked so smooth, attractive, and alluring. It was taking every single gram of Stephen's willpower not to go over to the hottie and run his fingers through that soft hair right there and then. Then he realized the hottie was actually staring and smiling at him too. Stephen's stomach tensed. It tightened into a knot. Sweat poured off his forehead. It had been ages since a man had liked him and focused on him. It wasn't natural, and Stephen had no idea what to do. Should he speak? Introduce himself? Offer the hottie a seat? Stephen stood up, then realized his throat was too dry to speak, and now everyone was staring at him. "I" was all Stephen could manage. "What do you mean this man is going to help us?" Natasha asked. Stephen forced himself to sit back down and focus on Natasha in her long brown hoodie that was bound to be hiding a knife or two or three, jeans and winter boots. "Help you?" the hottie asked. "Why would you need my help?" Stephen had to admit that he needed to say something to get answers, but his damn throat was still too dry. "You have an assignment to do, and we need the expertise of a computer science expert, and HQ has cleared him," Tom said. Natasha threw her arms up in the air, and Stephen completely agreed that Tom should not have mentioned HQ. "They also wanted to recruit him," Tom said. Now Tom had really crossed the point of no return, and Stephen gave a careful eye on Natasha in case she went for the hottie. "What the hell is this?" the hottie asked, clearly getting more and more concerned. "What the hell do you want to recruit me for?" The only major problem with all of this, and Stephen seriously hated this problem, was that their work at the university was extremely top secret because not even the university itself knew that MI5 and MI6 and other agencies were running operations to keep the university's research out of enemy hands. And even if their operation was hinted at and even partially exposed, then this would all end very, very badly. All of their careers in intelligence work could be over way before they had even begun. "Why the hell are you telling Hottie this?" Stephen asked, a little more forcefully than he meant to. "Because the Iranians are here. There's an attack about to happen and we need expertise," Tom said. Stephen just looked at Natasha. "Well, I guess we now have to brief the Hottie." "You think I'm a hottie," he said. Stephen's mouth dropped instantly, as soon as he realized how silly he had been. Damn it, he was never this silly around a boy normally. "Sit down," Natasha said to both Tom and the hottie. Stephen just stared at the hottie as he carefully walked over to their round wooden table, and Stephen was really fighting the urge to run his hand under the hottie's white t-shirt and kiss those amazing lips. Stephen wanted to laugh at himself for being so head over heels for this guy, but he forced himself to behave. After a moment of hesitation, the hottie sat down next to Stephen, and Stephen had to sit on his hands to make sure he didn't accidentally do anything. "I know your name is Phill Lee," Natasha said, "and I know Tom wouldn't lie about HQ clearing you and wanting you to join us. We are a small unit working for the UK government on protecting the university's top secret research against the UK's enemies." Stephen had to admit Natasha was always great at giving the official talk about what they did, and she did it with such a serious tone that Stephen didn't know whether to be scared or not. And Phill was a very hot name for a very hot man. "Really?" Phill asked, laughing like this was all some kind of joke. Natasha folded her arms. "You guys don't work for the government," Phill said, laughing so hard no sound was coming out. "It's true," Tom said. Phill kept laughing and shook his head. Stephen just smiled because he had seen this reaction plenty of times, and it was always fun to watch, but not when they had a deadline and an attack to stop. Against his better judgment, Stephen took out a hand from under his butt and gently grabbed one of Phil's shoulders. Stephen was instantly amazed at how wonderful Phil's shoulders were. He definitely worked out, and his shoulders felt amazingly toned. Now Stephen was just wondering what else was toned so perfectly. And Stephen really enjoyed the sheer chemistry that was flowing between him and Phill. "It's true," Stephen said, amazed he could even force that out. Then Phill stopped laughing, grinning and smiling. His face just went pale, and he frowned. "And," Stephen said, "unless you help us figure out how to stop a cyber attack, Iran is going to get their hands on a lot of nuclear research." Phil's face went even paler, and Stephen fully understood why. This was bad. Very bad indeed. Phill flat out couldn't believe this was actually happening. He couldn't understand in the slightest why the hell the government was spying on the university. And could these people really be trusted? Phill didn't really know how he could possibly believe them. It just seemed so crazy that they were spies or whatever they called themselves. It was so strange because they looked so normal. Phill would have imagined them to look like older men in posh suits. They definitely weren't wearing them, as they all sat around the little round wooden table. And the fact that they wanted him to join them, or help them, or just do something for them, was even crazier. Time is ticking, the woman called Natasha said. Phill slowly nodded his head. He didn't know what to do. This was all too much information. He had truly believed that he was going on a nice meetup with his best friend. He didn't know he was about to enter the spy game. Then Phill just focused on the really cute, beautiful man sitting next to him. He had to admit the man had been acting strange ever since he saw him, but there was something so cute about him. We need to know how Iran could pull a cyber attack on the university, the cutie said. Phill was surprised. It was the most the cute man had said to him all day. Who are you? Phill asked. The cutie smiled. Stephen. Boys. Men. Lovebirds, Natasha said. Focus. 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 Phill and Stephen laughed, and it was so great to feel their attraction to each other run through Phill. He really wanted to get to know Stephen a lot better. Well, Phill said, deciding the best way to make Stephen like him was to prove his intelligence. Iran, if what you say is true, couldn't pull off a normal cyber attack by hacking into the computer systems from the outside. The university has security too good for that. Phill loved it how Stephen was on the edge of his seat and hanging on to Phil's every word. At best, Iran might be able to break the first few levels of defense into student records and stuff, but they wouldn't be able to get to the research, Phill said. Natasha nodded and looked at Tom. How would you commit the attack? Stephen asked, grinning. Phill loved Stephen's sense of humor. It was a very well-kept secret that most of the time computer science students wanting to focus on security had to think just as much about how to break into computer systems as how to defend them. This is a university with a lot of deliveries. I would infect of the new pieces of equipment being delivered, Phill said. Oh, Tom said. He's good. Can we keep him? Phill loved how wide Stephen's grin got. He looked so cute, and everyone looked at Natasha, who he was starting to understand must have been their leader or something. Maybe, she said. Tom, look into what deliveries are scheduled to be made today. Focus on new equipment being delivered to the Georgian building. Phill was impressed. He had always wondered why the Georgian building was basically off-limits to students and most staff members. He never would have guessed it was a top-secret research building. None, Tom said, looking up from his laptop. Stephen clicked his fingers. Actually, I like Phil's idea, but you're thinking about it wrong. Phill moved his chair over to be closer to this insanely hot man. Phill got so close to beautiful Stephen that he could feel his body warmth radiating off him. There is a lot more equipment that goes into that building than deliveries, Stephen said. What the researchers bring in themselves, Phill said. That was seriously clever of Stephen to work out. But all researchers are checked weekly by MI5, Natasha said. Yes, Phill said, but if what you're saying is true, then that only checks if they have turned against the government, not if they accidentally picked up something by mistake. Oh God, Tom said. What? Natasha asked. My stupid university, Stephen said. It took a few moments for Phill to realize what Tom and beautiful Stephen meant, but they had all received tons of university emails about it. Today was the only day staff members, postgraduate students, and researchers were allowed to attend the careers fairs in the sports hall. There would be so many freebies and USB sticks being given away that it would only take one infected USB stick and one careless researcher for Iran's mission to be done. Everyone stood up and packed their laptops away. How do we know what we're looking for? Phill asked. Everyone laughed. We won't until we get there, Stephen said. Everyone started heading out the door. Phill with me? Stephen said as the others grabbed earpieces. Phil's stomach filled with excitement at the idea of spending more time with wonderful Stephen. Even if they were about to hopefully stop a deadly cyber attack that would cost hundreds of thousands of lives if they failed. Stephen hated the massive sports hall that was the size of football pitches, with hundreds of researchers lecturers, and other staff members, tightly packed between rows upon rows of stalls. It was a security nightmare, and this was flat out not what Stephen wanted at this moment. But he was more than glad sexy Phill had joined him, and Phill was so closely behind Stephen that he could enjoy Phil's warmth against him. Yet not quite as much as he wanted to, because of the massive security threat looming over them as Stephen glided through the crowd. "What are we looking for?" Phill asked. "Anything that isn't right," Stephen said, knowing exactly how vague that sounded to non-intelligence officers. Stephen seriously didn't like how many international governments and companies from the Middle East were present today. Any one of them could be an Iranian agent or none at all. Iran wouldn't be the first enemy of the UK to use its own people as agents. This was a nightmare. "No sign of anyone yet," Natasha said through Stephen's earpiece. This wasn't good. Stephen felt completely lost in the sea of people that kept bumping and smashing into him. Then he heard something. Stephen could have sworn he heard some Arabic, but it was mutilated. Arabic normally sounded beautiful and rather lyrical in a strange fashion, but the English accent in this Arabic murdered it. Stephen looked around, but he couldn't see anything. Phill carefully turned Stephen around and looked into his eyes. Stephen really loved looking at Phill, but this wasn't the time. "What's wrong, and think it through," Phill said. Stephen just nodded. He was too caught up in all of Phil's beauty, but he was right, damn him. Stephen needed to focus on the problem and not get overwhelmed in all the chaos this sports hall represented. "We need to find possible Iranian agents in here. They want to give an infected USB stick to one of the nuclear researchers," Stephen said. "We need to go to the biggest physics research company here," Phill said. Stephen just nodded and glided through the crowd a lot more forcefully. He bumped into tons of men and women as he almost charged towards the government's stand here. The UK government had a massive stand trying to show the researchers and lecturers how great and powerful it was. Stephen knew it wasn't, but it was always good to see the government try. There were 5 middle-aged men standing behind the row of silver tables talking to researchers, including one of the nuclear researchers from the university that Stephen recognized. The nuclear researcher with his balding head was talking to the only white man at the station, and Stephen just knew that he was the Iranian agent. Stephen charged through the crowd. He watched the man give the researcher a USB stick. They were talking in Arabic. The researcher was in on it. "Stop!" Stephen shouted. The nuclear researcher legged it. "We have a runner!" Stephen shouted into his earpiece. The white man whipped out a gun. He fired. People screamed. Phill tackled Stephen to the ground. Stephen rolled onto the ground. Everyone ran to the exits. He leapt up, charging across the sports hall. Stephen jumped into the air, leaping over the silver tables. The white man fired again, missing Stephen. 2 black men and an Asian woman tackled the gunman to the ground. Stephen landed next to the gunman, punching him in the face. "You fool," the white man shouted. "You have stopped nothing. My friends will end you and your pathetic country." Then the idiot started shouting and screaming in murdered Arabic and twisting the peaceful religion of Islam to their messed up ideology. Stephen just shook his head because their intel was very wrong here. This wasn't a plot sanctioned by the Iranian government. This was just a group of sad, pathetic men wanting to do terror for no real reason at all, except the silly ideas in their heads. 3 gunshots echoed. Stephen spun around. A gunman fired at Stephen. Stephen saw the muzzle flash. The bullets screamed towards him. Stephen started to move. Phill kicked Stephen out the way. Blood splashed against Stephen's face. Another shot went off. Tom killed the gunman, presumably the white man's only friend here. Stephen's eyes just widened as he looked at Phill. Phill was bleeding heavily. "Call a fucking ambulance," Stephen shouted, his training kicking in. Stephen went straight over to Phill, pressing down all his weight on the gunshot wounds. Stephen's hands were covered in blood, but he just hoped he could stop the bleeding enough until help arrived. And he seriously hoped it would arrive soon. Stephen just couldn't lose beautiful Phill. The next few hours were a complete and utter blur to Phill. The only thing he could possibly remember was the shouting of doctors in the operation theater, them demanding more blood, and the massive blinding light that shone in his face every single damn time he regained consciousness. Phill didn't even really know where he was now. He of course knew that he was in a hospital of some sort because he was in a white plastic chair with more than enough medical equipment stuck into him, down his nose, and constantly monitoring him, but he wasn't sure if he was still in Canterbury or not. Phill managed to see the bright gray walls of the hospital room out of the corner of his eye, but Phill felt like he had been parked by the nurse or whoever had gotten him here, in front of a very beautiful view of a lustrous green field with sunflowers and wheat and blackberries gentle blowing in the wind through large floor-to-ceiling windows. Of course Phill knew that this wasn't real, and it was just an extremely effective TV screen, but it was beautiful. And thankfully, the hospital didn't stink of horrible cleaning chemicals, death, or anything else that Phill normally associated with hospitals. This one smelt very pleasant with hints of lavender, jasmine, and orange that reminded him of Christmas pudding as a child with his family. "I didn't think you were going to make it," Stephen said behind him. Phill felt his stomach churn and tighten for a moment. He was only realizing now that he was so relieved that Stephen was well. When Phill had heard the gunshots and seen the man aim at Stephen, Phill didn't know what came over him. He just ran and had to make sure Stephen wasn't hit. It had never crossed his mind that he might be putting himself in danger, or risk of injury, or even risk of death. It just felt like the right thing to do, and Phill honestly knew he wouldn't have changed it for anything. He would always save Stephen no matter what, which was weird in a way, because Stephen was a cute, beautiful man that Phill had only met a few hours before. But it was still true. Stephen walked into view and laughed at the TV screen in the windows in front of them both. "These windows have gotten better since I was here last," Stephen said, folding his arms, and looked at Phill. Stephen looked so cute in the same clothes as earlier, and for some reason Phill didn't know whether to be disturbed or not that Stephen's hands were still covered in his blood. Phill watched Stephen get on his knees, so his beautiful eyes were level with Phil's. "Why did you save me?" Stephen asked. Phill laughed because it was such a weird question that Phill didn't see the point in. As his stomach tensed and flipped and filled with butterflies, the answer was so obvious because Stephen was a beautiful man that was clever, kind, and Phill could see how much he loved his job and helping people. It was those sort of people that just had to survive no matter what. But Phill wanted to tell Stephen a short answer. "Because I like you and want you to live," Phill said, only now realizing how true that was. Stephen laughed. "It isn't every day I get shot at, and even have cute men trying to save me." "Tom's cute. Doesn't he save you?" Phill asked, poking his tongue out at Stephen. "I prefer you to Tom," Stephen said. Phill smiled because it was amazing to see how much Stephen's eyes were lighting up the more they talked. There was such a glimmer in his eyes that was so cute, and Phill really wanted to get to know Stephen a lot better. "Just ask me out already," Phill said seductively. Stephen shrugged like this was nothing. "How do you know I'm into you? I am an intelligence officer. I could be playing you." Phill laughed and started coughing as his medical equipment bleeped. "I don't even know how long I have left. Do you really want a dying man to die, not knowing if you like him or not?" Stephen playfully hit Phill and kissed him on the lips. Phill almost jumped out of his skin at the sheer electricity and passion that flowed between them. It was the most passionate and sensual kiss Phill had ever had. "You aren't going to die," Stephen said. "I won't let that happen." And as Phill stared into Stephen's perfect dark eyes, he just knew exactly what was going to happen now. They were going to keep talking, making each other laugh, and almost certainly kiss a lot more for the rest of the day. And beyond that, Phill had a very strong suspicion he had a boyfriend. A boyfriend that he would always protect, kiss, and probably fall in love in a few weeks' time. Because Stephen really was a perfect guy that was caring, clever, and loving. Exactly what he had always wanted in a man, and now he was thankfully going to get it, and it had only taken him being shot to realize it. After an amazing afternoon and evening with Phill, Stephen just stood leaning against the perfectly warm wooden doorframe of Phil's hospital room as he watched Phill fall asleep. Phill looked so cute, peaceful, and alive when he slept. After the chaos and stress and worry of today, and not knowing if wonderful Phill was ever going to make it, Stephen just focused on Phil's fit, sexy stomach rise and fall under the thin blue bedsheets that the hospital had provided him with. At least the little white plastic hospital bed was comfortable, but it would have been great if it had been bigger. All Stephen really wanted to do was spend the night with Phill, just to make sure he was okay. The quiet sound of nurses and doctors and porters doing their rounds echoed up and down the bright grey corridors of the private hospital just south of Canterbury that the UK government had agreed to pay for, in exchange for Stephen not going public with it was one of their people that was the danger today. "Are you ever going to wash your hands?" Natasha and Tom asked as one as they kissed Stephen's cheeks. Stephen looked down at his hands. All the blood had mostly gone away for the most part, but they were still streaks from where he had tried, and thankfully had, saved Phil's life. "The government and MI5 are grateful," Natasha said. "I caught the nuclear researcher with the memory stick before he could use it, and it was their plan to use the careers fair as a cover, so in case the stick was traced back to the researcher, he could say someone at the fair gave it to him." Stephen nodded, and forced himself to look away from beautiful Phill. "Thanks both, but Tom, why did you bring him today?" Tom shrugged. "Because you need a boyfriend. Like seriously, when was the last time you had dick or something?" Stephen was so not going to dignify that with a response, mainly because he didn't know himself. "Oh," Natasha said, pulling out her phone. "I got an email just now, and we all have a new assignment together, and we have a new trainee with us who had accepted a job offer." Stephen just grinned. He loved it that Phill had accepted the job offer he had been emailed about an hour ago. "The three of us with Phill," Natasha said, "are heading to Sweden to go to university there as part of a joint operation with the Swedish Secret Service. Apparently, there's some neo-Nazi group trying to recruit British students." Stephen felt his stomach buzz with excitement. All the tension in his shoulders and body relaxed, and he was seriously looking forward to the future. Because he was with his best friends in the entire world, and now he was going to be with a very cute man that he could finally call his boyfriend, and after years of being an intelligence officer, Stephen had very good senses about people and things and relationships. And he just had a feeling that him and Phill weren't going to be breaking up for ages, if ever, and he was perfectly fine, happy, and delighted about that.
Welcome back everyone, it's me again, Connor Whiteley. So I really hope that you enjoyed today's story, because I flat out love writing, creating stories and sharing them with you. If you really enjoyed today's story, then please remember to like, comment and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content, and the engagement really helps the Whiteleyverse with the YouTube algorithms. And if you want to buy this short story or any of my other fiction, then they're available from all major ebook retailers, and you can get them from your local library if you requested, and you can order the paperback copies from Amazon, your local bookstore or local library if you request it. Lastly, if you want to support the channel on a one-off basis, then you can now buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Connor Whiteley. Also, if you know anyone who would enjoy today's story, then please share it with them. I'm always really grateful when you wonderful people help spread the word about the channel. So, thanks for watching the Whiteleyverse, and I'll see you again soon. Have a great day, everyone.